Hi, my name is Alex Carey. I am a third year music theater student here at Sam Houston State University. And today I will be discussing the emergence of theatrical production as contested space within late Ottoman Egypt. Specifically, I will be examining the historical, political, and cultural role of theatrical production in Egypt under the rule of Khedive Ismail from 1863 to 1879, in order to argue for the active function of theater in the popularization of nationalist tendencies and resistance to Khedive rule. Furthermore, I will be focusing on the works of Egyptian playwright Ya'qub al-Sanur, and I will discern that it is possible to see how the play's literary structure, content, and popular consumption were crucial not only to challenging the social and political fabric of the Khedive's Egypt, but building a foundation for cultural production as resistance. Now, Ya'qub Sanur is an Egyptian nationalist and playwright who was attributed the title of fathering modern Egyptian colloquial culture. Born to an Italian Jewish father and an Egyptian Jewish mother, Sanur felt a deep sense of connection to his homeland that went beyond his religious identity, centering the people and the land above all. The focus on indigeneity and connection to people, life, and land is more than just an abstract political idea. It plays a material function in the social organization of his theater. In order to better understand Ya'qub Sanur's plays and how they materially impacted the Khedive rule, I frame the emergence of art through the context of finance capitalism and the origins of imperialism in Egypt. So to begin with some definitions, finance capitalism is a stage of capitalism in which economic and political dominion is exercised by financial institutions and or financiers rather than by industrial capitalists themselves. Under finance capitalism, a large portion of industrial capital is not owned by the industrialists who employ it. Rather, they obtain it through the use only through the medium of banks, which, in relation to them, represent the owners of capital. Now, the emergence and practice of finance capitalism in the late 19th century was a primary characteristic of Britain and France's relationship to Egypt. Beginning in 1863, Ismail pursued a number of projects aimed at modernizing Egypt's social, political, and economic institutions, while establishing and codifying his and his lineage's power through dynastic rule. Ismail established mixed courts, which conceded the power of the state to foreign consuls which occupied Egypt, attracting a European expatriate population totaling over 100,000 in Cairo and Alexandria, and functionally existing as a dual power to the Khedive. He reformed the established institutions of public education, in which only French and English were taught, financed the establishment of Cairo and Alexandria to have, quote, tree-lined boulevards, gardens, parks, a railroad, unquote, and most importantly, to this paper, an opera house that was constructed as the Bekiya Gardens, which was sort of a boulevard and a cultural hub. Um, Lastly, of course, he opened the Suez Canal in 1869. To support these projects, Ismail turned to the capital-rich nations such as those of Britain and France to finance these reforms. The financing of these reforms resulted in the establishment of an unpayable debt on behalf of Egypt to Britain and France. For example, Ismail's 1873 loan, in which European bankers issued Egyptian shares for a nominal value of 32 million euros, resulting in a compounded debt of 77 million euros that Egypt had to pay back over the course of 30 years. Unable to pay these loans back, Egypt was forced to sell their shares in its infrastructure back to financiers, Britain and France. Functionally, this relinquished the power and autonomy of Egypt to Europe, because if you have a control or dominion over the institutions, you therefore have a control and dominion over what is produced in them and how they function. And this context is important for two reasons. First, it allows us to understand Ismail functionally playing a facilitative role in the relinquishing of state power to foreign dominion and its subsequent relationship to the people. And second, it allows us to understand the historical dynamics of theatrical production during Sanur's time. The financial control of Britain secured over Egyptian theater meant that they were functionally able to utilize it for their own benefit, producing shows that catered to the elite, land aristocracy, and expatriate populations of Egypt, influencing public opinion through the dissemination of productions sympathetic to European customs and ideals, all the while profiting off of it. Understanding the material conditions by which theater was produced in Khedive Egypt allows us to understand both why theater would be used as resistance and how it functioned as a vehicle of it. Now, Yaqub Sinar's theatrical tradition began with the production of satirical plays. Satire, of course, is a form of artistic expression in which vices, follies, abuses, and shortcomings are held up for ridicule, with the intent of shaming individuals, governments, or society itself into improvement. As a European educated playwright and polyglot who, in his earlier years, wrote in favor of the Khedive, Ismail chose Sanur and his theater troupe to perform at the Ezbekiye Garden, one of the aforementioned cultural hubs constructed by Ismail in the era of European finance reforms. Sanur's favor with Ismail, however, was short lived. After only 3 plays were erected, Sanur's theater was shut down in 1872, and Sanur himself subsequently exiled from the country. To understand why this happened, I will focus on Sanur's play El Duratain, or The Co-Wives. El Duratain is written about a woman named Subaha and the knowledge she is forced to reckon with. Her husband, King Ahmad's pursuit of a polygamous relationship. Sanur writes that Subaha is rightfully upset. The play begins with a confrontation of Subaha with King Ahmed, asking why he should choose to initiate a second relationship while he is happily married to Subaha, to which the king coyly dodges, only to admit that his new wife is only 16 years old, half the age of Subaha. King Ahmed insists that he is only marrying Fatoume, the 16-year-old aforementioned, to assist Subaha. And once Fatoume begins living with both of them, Subaha commits herself to making the lives of both Fatoume and King Ahmed a nightmare. Now, with regards to the literary structure, social organization, and mass consumption, Sanur's El Duratain directly attacks not only the legal and social conditions of women at a collective level, but alludes to the social practices of Ismail himself through his character development. To this aim, he publicly threatens the Western legitimacy Ismail through the financing of the theater sought to cultivate. To start at a collective level, laws regarding divorce and polygamous marriages under Ismail were largely codified at the expense of the well-being of women in Khedive Egypt. Sunir highlights the deeply one-sided nature of polygamous marriages, and by highlighting Sabaha's perceived inability to leave the marriage, criticizes the inability of the Khedive state to adequately protect the Egyptian people as a whole. More pertinent to this example, however, is his evocation of Ismail's own personal relationship habits to drive his point. And to frame this, it's important to note 2 things. One, that the title of Khedive was a particularly new title, essentially meaning lord, that was given to Ismail specifically as a way to give him a higher rank than the pashas or rulers before him. Now, with this, Ismail was deeply concerned with securing dynastic rule for his family, and through acquisition to European capital and entrenchment in high society in Europe, he was in many ways and could in many ways be described as almost trying to amass the position of a king. And with this, the specific act of polygamy is not innate to the upper or ruling class of Egypt at the time. On the contrary, So by making Ahmed's character a king, Dinar is directly addressing Ismail's behavior. For Ismail was involved in a polygamous marriage, the youngest of his wives being a 19-year-old woman. So in many ways, Sanura is directly addressing Ismail's behavior as corrupt, and with the story identifying King Ahmed's second wife as only 16 years old, calling out the literal and figurative predatory nature of Ismail. Now, this play, as previously named, was performed at the Ezbekiye Garden, a cultural hub modeled after Paris and made for the benefit of European expatriates. By characterizing Ismail as he did through King Ahmed, Sanur is strategically utilizing the publicly and heavily attended platform to delegitimize Ismail to the demographic he, through his reforms, most closely sought to emulate and gain the affirmation of. Furthermore, Sanur's theater troupe was made up of Egyptians from all social and gender backgrounds, meaning that the construction of his theater was not only the elite as theater had been at his time, but was by the Egyptian masses and was gender specific to the roles he was portraying. So Sabaha was portrayed by a woman from a lower class. Um, so additionally, his plays were written and performed exclusively in colloquial Egyptian Arabic. So colloquial that I, as a native Arabic speaker, had to ask my Egyptian comrades and friends to help me translate. The use of colloquial Arabic and the Egyptian masses serves as both a cultural and demographic threat to the modernizing reforms Ismail sought to implement. As aforementioned, all public and state-sanctioned educational institutions were conducted in French and English, particularly because Ismail was trying to cultivate a modernized state um, that modeled the West, pushing themselves away from its indigenous past. Um, and therefore, the act of mobilizing the masses through his theater troupe for a distinctly Egyptian colloquial critique of Ismail can be understood as more than just a subversive political attack, but an instance of cultural insurgency to political institutions. By making his theater quite literally only accessible to the masses who spoke Arabic, he discouraged European expatriates from purchasing tickets, which resulted in a financial impact for Ismail, who was already crippling under European debts, all the while producing a direct criticism of Ismaili rule to the Egyptian masses. So, in conclusion, we can understand that the construction of scenarios theater by mobilizing the masses um, of all social and gendered backgrounds to produce a play at an institution erected for the expatriate population, modeled after Europe and financed by Europe, we can understand how theater can be used as a direct attack on Khedive rule by public defamation, by disseminating political thought critical to Ismail's reforms. So in conclusion, I argue that Sunnah used theater as an active form of resistance to the Khedive rule. Um, Thank you so much.